Every country on Earth is in debt. The United States owes $38 trillion. Japan owes $9 trillion. The entire planet owes $315 trillion. 3 times the size of the global economy. But here's the paradox that should terrify you. If everyone owes money, who exactly is owed? The answer isn't what you think. Because when you follow the chain of creditors, when you track who actually holds the debt, you discover something disturbing. The world doesn't owe money to anyone in particular. It owes money to itself. But 4 men, 4 bankers across 3 centuries, designed it that way deliberately. They built a system where debt can never be repaid, where governments borrow forever, where interest flows eternally upward, and where the people who designed the trap profit from every payment, every crisis, and every bailout. This isn't a conspiracy, this is documented history. The meetings happen, the contracts exist, the mechanisms are public record, and once you see how they built it, you'll understand why $38 trillion isn't a problem to be solved. It's the system working exactly as designed. Let me show you the 4 architects, the 4 moments when the debt trap was engineered, and why every government on Earth is now caught inside it with no way out. Before 1694, kings borrowed money the old way. They'd go to merchants or nobles and promise repayment with interest, and if they couldn't pay, they'd default. Creditors lost money. Kings borrowed from someone else. It was risky for lenders and embarrassing for kings, but it was contained. Debt was temporary, either repaid or defaulted. The system cleared. William Patterson changed everything. He was a Scottish merchant and financial schemer who tried and failed multiple times to get rich. In 1691, he had an idea that would reshape civilization. England was at war with France. King William III needed money desperately. The treasury was empty. Patterson approached the king with a proposal. He would organize a group of wealthy merchants to lend the government $1.2 million. That's about $300 million in today's money, a massive sum. But here's the innovation. The loan would never be repaid. Instead, the government would pay interest forever, 8% annually. And to manage this arrangement, Patterson proposed creating a new institution, the Bank of England. The mechanics were revolutionary. The merchant lenders would give their gold to the Bank of England. The bank would lend it to the government would pay interest annually from tax revenue, and the bank would pay that interest to the merchant lenders. But here's the critical detail. The government wouldn't repay the principal ever. The loan was permanent. Why would merchants accept this? Because the interest payment was guaranteed by Parliament. It was backed by the government's taxing power. As long as England could tax its citizens, the interest would flow. Parliament approved Patterson's scheme in 1694. The Bank of England was chartered. The merchants provided their gold. The government got its war funding, and for the first time in history, national debt became permanent. Not a problem to solve, but a feature of the system. Within 50 years, every major European power copied the model. Patterson died in 1719, not particularly wealthy despite creating the Bank of England, but the system he built persists 331 years later. The debt trap was set in 1694, and every government since has walked into it willingly. By the early 1800s, European governments had embraced debt, but there was no organized market. Each loan was negotiated individually. Nathan Rothschild changed that. He industrialized sovereign debt. Nathan Rothschild in London was the strategic genius. During the Napoleonic Wars, Nathan arranged loans for Britain, but his innovation was how he structured them. Instead of lending directly to the government, he bought government bonds at a discount and resold them to investors at a markup. He created a secondary market. The government needed money. Rothschild provided it immediately. Then he sold the bonds to pension funds, insurance companies, and wealthy individuals. The government got its money fast. Rothschild collected the spread, and investors got a tradable asset. But here's where it gets darker. Rothschild didn't just finance governments. He positioned himself so governments had no choice but to use him. In 1815, at the Battle of Waterloo, Nathan Rothschild famously learned of Napoleon's defeat before anyone else in London. His courier network was faster than official channels. He used this information to manipulate the bond market. First, he sold British bonds, signaling that Britain was losing. Prices collapsed. Other investors panicked and sold. Then, after prices crashed, Rothschild bought massive quantities at rock-bottom prices. When news of British victory arrived the next day, bond prices surged. This established the Rothschild model: control the information, control the issuance, control the market. But here's why this matters for the debt trap. Before Rothschild, governments could theoretically refuse to pay. If a king defaulted, his creditors lost money and the system reset. But Rothschild made sovereign debt tradable across borders. A British bond might be owned by a French investor who sold it to a German bank. The web of ownership became so complex that defaulting wasn't just refusing one creditor, it was collapsing an entire international financial network. This is the Rothschild innovation. Make debt so interconnected that default becomes impossible. Governments became trapped. They had to keep paying, and they had to keep borrowing to pay the interest on old debts. The debt trap was no longer just permanent. It was inescapable. By 1900, America was becoming an economic powerhouse, but it still had a primitive financial system. Banks operated independently. Money supply was tied to gold, and there was no central mechanism to manage debt. J.P. Morgan fixed that, not for the public good, but to protect his banking empire. In 1907, there was a financial panic. Stock prices crashed, banks failed, and the economy seized up. J.P. Morgan personally organized a bailout, but he knew he couldn't do it again. So Morgan and his associates, the most powerful bankers in America, designed a permanent solution. They needed a central bank, but Americans hated central banks, so Morgan's group disguised it. In 1910, Morgan's associates held a secret meeting on Jekyll Island, Georgia. For 9 days, they designed the structure of what would become the Federal Reserve System. The plan was brilliant political manipulation. It looked decentralized, democratic, and public, but the structure ensured banker control. And the most important power, the power to create money and buy government bonds, was given to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which was controlled by the largest Wall Street banks. The Federal Reserve Act passed Congress in December 1913, and immediately the debt trap expanded. Now, the government didn't just borrow from banks, it borrowed from the Federal Reserve, which could create money to buy bonds. Here's why this matters. Before the Federal Reserve, there was a limit to how much the government could borrow, but the Federal Reserve could create money by purchasing government bonds. The government issues a bond, the Fed buys it with newly created money, the government spends the money, and the debt goes on the Fed's balance sheet, backed by nothing but the promise that taxpayers will service it forever. This is the mechanism that enables infinite debt. The Federal Reserve ensures there's always a buyer for government bonds, so the government never has to stop borrowing. Morgan died in 1913, but his legacy is the structure that makes the current $38 trillion in U.S. debt possible. But for decades, there was still one fragile barrier holding back the flood: gold. Even with the Federal Reserve, the dollar was still tethered to physical gold stored in vaults. This limited how much they could print. That barrier was destroyed on August 15, 1971. President Richard Nixon suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Overnight, money stopped being a store of value and became a tool of policy. This was the moment the fiat era truly began. Without gold anchoring the system, debt was no longer backed by assets, but merely by confidence. This allowed the government to print money not just for wars, but for everything. Look at the charts. Before 1971, wages and productivity rose together. After 1971, productivity kept rising, but wages flattened. The wealth didn't disappear. It was siphoned off by the inflation created to service the debt. This was the silent theft of the middle class executed 50 years ago, and we are still paying the price. By the 1970s, the debt trap Patterson, Rothschild, and Morgan built was functioning globally. But developing nations were different. They borrowed for infrastructure, and many couldn't keep up payments. The debt trap was reaching its limits until Paul Volcker made it permanent. Volcker was Federal Reserve Chairman from 1979 to 1987. He faced inflation over 10%. To stop it, He raised interest rates dramatically to 20%. This crushed inflation. But it had another effect. Developing nations like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina had borrowed billions in dollars when rates were low. Now those loans were due, and the interest rates had tripled. In August 1982, Mexico announced it couldn't make payments. This should have triggered a global financial collapse. But Volcker didn't let the market clear. Instead, he orchestrated a bailout through the International Monetary Fund, IMF. The IMF would lend nations enough money to keep making interest payments to American banks. But the loans came with conditions. Governments had to cut spending, privatize state assets, and open markets to foreign investment. The IMF loans didn't reduce debt, they just rolled it over, made it manageable but permanent. This is the Volcker innovation. When debt becomes unpayable, don't forgive it, restructure it. Lend enough to keep interest payments flowing and extract political concessions in exchange. But how does this affect you personally? Why does the stock market go up while your purchasing power goes down? Economists have a name for this mechanism, the Cantillon effect. It explains why this system doesn't just create debt, it manufactures inequality. When the central bank prints trillions to buy bonds, that new money doesn't appear in your bank account. It goes to the banks and financial institutions first. They use it to buy assets, stocks, real estate, and commodities before prices go up. By the time that money trickles down to your wages, prices have already risen. The financiers bought at the bottom. You are forced to buy at the top. This is why the stock market hits all-time highs while the average family can't afford groceries. It is a feature, not a bug. The system is designed to inflate the assets of the wealthy while devaluing the labor of the working class. Now let me show you how these four architects built a system where debt is infinite and escape is impossible. Start with Patterson's model. Government borrows, pays interest forever, never repays principal. Add Rothschild's innovation, make the debt tradable globally. So it's not one creditor, it's a web. Default collapses the system. Add Morgan's mechanism, central banks create money to buy government bonds, unlimited demand. The government can always borrow more. Add Volcker's trap. When countries can't pay, restructure, don't forgive, keep the interest flowing. The result is what we have today. 315 trillion in global debt. Government debt, corporate debt, household debt, none of it will ever be repaid. All of it pays interest, and all of it is connected through the financial system, so default anywhere threatens collapse everywhere. Here's why this can never end. If the US paid off its $38 trillion, the money supply would collapse. Because dollars are created when the government borrows, if it paid off the debt, those dollars would disappear. Deflation, depression, economic collapse. So, the government can never pay it off. It has to keep borrowing, keep rolling it over, and keep paying interest. The same is true globally. If every government paid off its debt, the global money supply would shrink by 2/3. There wouldn't be enough money to conduct trade, the system would seize. So debt can't be eliminated, it's structural, necessary by design. And here's who profits. The institutions that hold the debt. They buy government bonds with other people's money, pension funds, retirement accounts, insurance premiums, and they collect the interest. It's the largest wealth transfer in history. Continuous, structural, and invisible to most people because it's not called a tax, it's called debt service. But it's the same mechanism. Workers pay, institutions collect, and the debt never decreases. And now, we are entering the final phase, the subscription serfdom. Because the debt is so high and the currency is so devalued, ownership is becoming impossible for the average person. Notice the shift? You don't own movies, you stream them. You don't own software, you subscribe to it. Soon, you won't own cars or homes. You will rent them from the same institutions that hold the debt. They are converting the national debt into a model where you pay a monthly fee just to exist. The debt trap has evolved from a financial mechanism into a lifestyle. You're not just a debtor, you are a permanent tenant in a world owned by the creditors. The four architects didn't conspire together, they lived in different centuries. But they each solved a problem in a way that benefited bankers, and each solution built on the previous one. Patterson made debt permanent in 1694. Rothschild made it global in 1815. Morgan made it infinite in 1913. Volcker made it inescapable in 1982. Together, they built a system where governments borrow forever and pay interest eternally. And the people who control the bonds, who manage the debt, who collect the interest, they're the ultimate beneficiaries, not governments, not taxpayers, the financial institutions. And here's the final truth: 38 trillion isn't a crisis for them. It's a business model. Every dollar of debt is an asset on someone's balance sheet. It pays interest. It provides collateral for more borrowing. And as long as confidence holds, as long as people believe the government will pay interest even if it never repays principal, the system functions. The debt trap is complete. An escape isn't possible. Not without collapsing the entire financial system. 4 architects, 3 centuries, 1 system, and everyone on Earth is now caught inside it. If this changed how you see government debt, if you finally understand that 38 trillion isn't an accident or mistake, but a system working exactly as designed, then you're starting to see how power actually works. Subscribe if you want to understand how the machine was built and who's operating it, because they're not going to teach you this in school. They're going to teach you that debt is a problem to solve. But the architects knew better. Debt isn't a problem. It's the foundation. And interest is the rent we pay to live in their world.